Hello, everybody. This is Professor Tippin, and welcome to the first of my lecture series on American federal government. This is POLS 1113, Rose State College. In this first part of my lecture series, we are covering two chapters. Typically, we will cover one chapter at a time. But for these first couple, the first chapter is just an introduction, literally titled People, Politics, and Participation. Not a whole lot of super important information, just some kind of introductory tidbits here and there that are important to cover. Dovetails pretty well with the Constitution, Chapter 2, the Constitution being a terrific launching pad, a starting point for learning about American federal government. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right on in. One of the things that the textbook emphasizes quite a bit is the fact that we do live in rapidly changing times. Specifically, the textbook emphasizes the role of technology in changing American politics. How it's already changed. We'll be learning about and talking the role and place of radio and television and how those have altered politics in our country and political culture. How will it continue to change it? Of course, here we are talking about the internet. Internet's been around for a couple of decades now, and we have some ideas about how the internet has changed politics in our country. But by and large, political scientists are still not totally sure about the full ramifications of the internet on our politics, political system, and political culture. So we'll be talking about these kinds of things, among others, for this semester. But beyond just technology, politics in America is changing for other reasons too. One big thing that's changing in America is demographics. The racial makeup of the United States and ethnic is changing fairly rapidly, and that is having ramifications for our politics and political culture. The age makeup of America is changing. The baby boomers, the largest generation in American history, is rapidly aging. How is that affecting our politics and political culture? Rural versus urban. People are moving in the United States, and they are largely abandoning rural areas for urban ones. We are having more and more people concentrated in urban spaces, cities, so to speak. How is that affecting our politics and political culture? One of the things that's changing in recent years as well is, since the 1970s, as we'll talk about here in a moment, cynicism has been probably the best emotion to describe American attitudes towards its government. Just kind of a general disbelief that government is effective or will do the right thing for people. In recent years, this attitude is giving way to more of a sense of anger. American politics is less and less cynical in its outlook and more angry. Two somewhat related emotions, but nevertheless are distinctly different. And the anger that is palpable in American politics today is affecting our government, our public culture, and how we interact with one another. So these are, some background ideas to keep in mind this semester as we are learning about American federal government. Okay, so the political context now. All right, let's say we are just pretty unfamiliar with American government and politics. We don't really follow it. We don't know that much about it. We're not that interested. That's all fine. One of my goals in this course is to get you interested in American politics and government if you weren't already. And in any event, whether you are or are not currently interested, maybe just to learn a little bit more about it, okay? So the heart of debate about policy in America, which is to say, what should the government do about problems, is the size and role of government, particularly the federal government. What we mean by that is, again, how active should the government be in our lives? We'll give you some more details on that later on in this lecture and in coming lectures, okay? But that's kind of the main topic of discussion in American politics right now, the size and role of government. There's a secondary debate going on regarding the role of America in the international arena, foreign policy, okay? Since World War II, the United States has been kind of a world leader in trying to, how should I say, enforce norms of democracy and human rights around the world. Should America do that? Or should America kind of stick to itself, so to speak? So the primary debate in American politics does involve around the size and role of government. Secondarily, American foreign policy is a big topic of discussion in the United States. People growing up today, or aware of politics today, understands probably what I mean by the fact that, people have cynical or angry attitudes towards government. That's not the way it's always necessarily been in the United States. This trend really kind of began in the early 1970s, largely due to the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, a war that government had gotten into. It was very divisive. Some people did, of course, support it, but it was widely unpopular for a number of reasons. The Watergate scandal, Nixon trying to spy on some of his political opponents. When that broke, that really created a lot of distrust in the US government. And more recently, government ineffectiveness, which is to say in political science known as gridlock, the government's kind of seeming inability to get a whole lot done. All these things have contributed to a growing distrust of government in the United States since the 1970s. Something to keep in mind as we, again, are learning about American politics and political culture. What are some consequences of this growing distrust? Okay, lack of efficacy. What do you mean by efficacy? The ability, or the thought that someone has the ability to affect change in government, okay? Most Americans do not believe that their voice counts, okay? If you polled most Americans, they would say that government, politicians don't really care about what I have to say, okay? With a lack of efficacy, becomes a loss of civic and political engagement. And what we mean by this is people doing politics. One of my hopes for the course this semester is to impress upon you that being involved in politics does not mean going out and voting for president every 4 years. Okay, it does not mean going out and voting every 2 years, if we want to include the midterm elections. Okay, being civically and politically engaged means, besides just voting, being aware of politics, following the news, engaging in politics, okay? Maybe you talk politics with colleagues, friends, neighbors, okay? Perhaps you volunteer for a candidate for office, okay? Maybe you donate, all right? There's many different ways that we can engage with politics and government in our country besides just voting. But because of the cynicism giving way to anger the last 40, 50 years, we do have fairly low rates of political efficacy, civic and political engagement in our country compared to other democracies, okay? So a little bit of background there. Well, we're in American federal government, okay? So what does the federal government actually do? Well, let's talk philosophically for a minute, okay? What should any government really do? All right, these are all things that any good government, we're talking about the United States federal government, the state of Oklahoma government, Oklahoma City, Midwest City, Japan, France, anywhere. Okay, what does any good government do? One of the first things that any good government should be doing is protecting its sovereign territory and citizenry, okay, providing for national defense. All right, all governments have a geographic jurisdiction, geographic territory. They need to protect it, protect the things and people inside them, all right? And they can help to do that by preserving order and stability. Important term here in political science is legitimacy, okay? What makes a government legitimate, all right? Are governments in charge? Well, who says so, okay? Something to keep in mind is in any society, all right, one of the roles of a government, one of the powers of a government is that the government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, okay? If the government says to do something and you don't want to, the government has the authority and ability to do something about that. Well, the main reason why anybody agrees to go along with this is because, for whatever the reasons may be, they're different from place to place, culture to culture, is people view government as legitimate. In situations where we have problems of legitimacy, where we do not view a government as being rightful or responsible, we start to have issues with order and stability. Okay, take for example Syria, which has been in a civil war for many years now. Certain segment of the population did not view the dictatorship as legitimate. They revolted, and here we are. Okay, all good governments establish and maintain legal systems. All right, rules, regulations about conduct, what to do, what not to do, consequences for not following said rules. Provide services. Okay, going back to this issue of, center of debate on policy in the United States. Okay, all good governments provide public goods to people. All right, things that everybody should use. What do we mean by public goods? Okay, which goods? Some pretty common ones you might think of are police, fire departments, fire protection, military, roads, okay? In most societies, including our own, there's not a whole lot of debate about certain public goods, okay? Most people probably see the value in a government maintaining fire departments or in maintaining infrastructure and roads, okay? Well, hypothetically, is healthcare a public good? That's a kind of a lightning rod in American politics today, okay? Is healthcare a right that the government should guarantee to people or not? Okay, should that be outside the purview of the government? All right. Related to providing public goods is, of course, all governments have or need the ability to raise and spend money, okay? Roads, police departments, the military, healthcare, perhaps, okay, all cost money, all right? And the way that we raise money typically is through, yes, the T word, taxes, all right? So all governments have the ability to raise taxes and spend that kind of income. And something that we might not think as being too obvious as a role of government is to socialize new generations, which is to say, to get new people acquainted with and familiar with politics and government in that area, okay? In a dictatorship, all right, one of the roles of the government is to socialize people into obeying. In a democracy, theoretically, one of the roles of the government is to socialize young people into becoming small d Democrats, which is to say, members of a democracy. Okay, what does it mean to be a citizen of a democracy? How does one participate, affect change in government, society, so on and so forth? We're going to stay philosophical here for a moment. And we're going to go back actually close to 2,500 years and meet perhaps what was often considered the grandfather of political science, the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Okay, now this is not a philosophy course, but nevertheless, to have a true appreciation for American government, it is good for us to have a even brief kind of background in political philosophy here, because after all, as we'll be discussing here in a little bit, American political identity is largely an issue of politics. Okay, what it means to be an American largely is a political question as opposed to, say, an ethnic or a cultural question. So, without further ado, Aristotle, about 2,500 years ago, came up with a typology of government in that all governments could be broken down into one of three categories based on who's in charge. Okay, we have monarchy, a rule of one, oligarchy, a rule of a few, and democracy, the rule of the many. Okay, now we can also categorize governments based on how they're structured and how they function. All right, we have totalitarian forms of government, governments that are extremely powerful and attempt to control the everyday aspects of life for its citizens. All right, might think of the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, or Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler as being examples of totalitarian states. North Korea, right now, a totalitarian state. We have authoritarianism. Similar to totalitarianism, authoritarian governments are ones where quite a bit of political power is concentrated within the state, or either a few or even a single individual. But the state doesn't necessarily try to order every little tidbit of social life in the country. China today could be a good example of an authoritarian state. Russia, right now, under Vladimir Putin, also an example of an authoritarian state. And then we also have constitutionalism, governments that are structured and ordered in a way in which certain rights and privileges are meant to be guaranteed to citizens, and one of the roles of the government is to protect those rights and responsibilities. Another term that we use in political science to describe constitutionalism is limited government. And it's what it sounds like, a government in which its powers are limited by law. Now, hypothetical question here, if you're paying attention, just want to give this some thought here. Based on these definitions, what kind of a country is the United States? We are often socialized into thinking of ourselves as what we might call a representative democracy. Us citizens don't actually have that much power in terms of the day-to-day affairs of running our country, but we do choose our leaders. We do choose the ones who do make those decisions. And so, by and large, most people, if were asked, what kind of a government is the United States, we'd probably say a constitutional democracy. Well, similarly, it might be arguable that the United States is also an oligarchy, because as already mentioned, oligarchy ruled by a few. The reality is the vast majority of the 330 million Americans don't have a say in the day-to-day operations of our country. A much smaller number of people do. So is the United States an oligarchy? Is it a democracy? No one correct answer for this, but more kind of a thought experiment, get you thinking critically about American government. Before we go any further, should mention that this is not a history course, but throughout our lectures for this semester, we will be doing some detours into history, okay? The reason being that if we want to understand where we are and why we're there, it's pretty important to know where we've been, okay? So where did American democracy come? Well, first off, for about, give or take about 1,000 years, the Middle Ages, the divine right of kings predominated as the principal political philosophy of Europe, okay? Europe, for 1,000 years, dominated by absolute monarchies, ruled by kings or queens, as it may be, with absolute power. And if we go back to this discussion of legitimacy, why are the kings in charge? Well, a fervent belief in Christianity, okay? If God is omnipotent, if God is all-powerful, then nothing happens that is against God's will. If I am king, that must mean that God wills it, so obey me, I'm the king. This starts to get questioned around the time of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The Renaissance, the 1500s, a rediscovery of, among other things, kind of the ancient Greek and Roman beliefs in rationality and reason. 1600s, we begin to apply those concepts not just to the natural world, making scientific discoveries, but to the social world. Okay, this application of the scientific method, reason, rationality to social life, we call the Enlightenment. And we have two concepts that come up during the Enlightenment: the social contract, natural law. Okay, social contract. Again, on this issue of legitimacy, all right, everybody exists in society. Why do we? Okay, the social contract, kind of a more like a thought experiment as to what makes an ordered and legitimate government and society. Okay, is it just because a king says God wills it, or does it come from somewhere else? That somewhere else, many Enlightenment philosophers decided was nature. Okay, beliefs that there are certain rights and privileges that all human beings have by virtue of them being human beings. For instance, the right to life. Okay, everyone has a right to defend themselves. That right does not come from a king because the king says so. That is a right from nature. Okay. Two important political philosophers from the Enlightenment for us to discuss briefly. One, John Locke. Okay, John Locke, an English political philosopher, wrote a few different political works. The most important for us is his second treatise on government, published in 1689. Among the other things that he discussed in there was that human beings have principally three natural rights. Again, rights that come before government, that precede government, and thus supersede government. That all human beings have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Okay? And for human beings to create legitimate governments, those governments must respect those three rights, must respect the right for every person to life, liberty, and property. We'll come back to that tripartite phrase here in a little bit when we start discussing the Constitution. French political philosopher by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's main contribution to American politics was this idea of popular sovereignty, okay? That if for whatever reason, a certain people decided that their government is no longer legitimate, that they have a right to rid themselves of that government, okay? That governments are not absolute. They are not ironclad once formed. People do, in fact, have a right to alter and even abolish their governments if they see fit. If you're all familiar with our history as far as the origins of our country, the revolution that we're getting to here in just a little bit, you can probably guess where Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas are going with regards to American history, okay? And again, for those who are aware of our history, you know, we did begin as a series of colonies of England, okay? The so-called 13 colonies were all fairly radical experiments in democracy at that point in time, the 16 and 1700s, okay? Both in direct and indirect democracy. Direct democracy, what we mean by this is a democratic system where people do have direct influence and control over the levers of government on a day-to-day basis. In many of the New England colonies, towns and other communities were governed directly by the people, where everybody voted on things at fairly regular town meetings. But of course, we also have experiments in indirect democracy. Now, I used the term representative democracy just a few moments ago. Indirect democracy, synonym here, okay? People choosing their leaders who then in turn make decisions for them, okay? Every colony had a colonial legislature, so every colony engaged in indirect democracy for anywhere from a century and a half to about 60, 70 years before the outbreak of the Revolution. Up in the north, in New England, we even have some social experiments in direct democracy. So even before the birth of our country, you know, we have, depending on where you are, upwards of 150 years of people being socialized to some kind of self-rule, either directly or indirectly. Now, sidestepping the history here for a moment, talk about American political cultures and values, okay? Philosophical question here. What does it mean to be an American, okay? And to help kind of preface that question, here's an alternate. What does it mean for someone to be Japanese? Okay, well, what does it mean for someone to be Japanese? Possibly that might mean someone was born in Japan, speaks Japanese, eats Japanese food, practices Japanese religion, does Japanese things. Similarly, what does it mean to be German? Okay, you could have pretty similar answers to that. And case in point, in Germany, they still have blood laws on the book as far as requirements to be a citizen. In order to become a citizen of Germany, one must have at least one half German ancestry, okay? In many countries, the question of what does it mean to be a member of that country is largely a cultural or ethnic question. In America, it can largely be argued that this issue is a political question. not an ethnic one. People choose to be Americans by engaging in certain key elements of American political culture, okay? The ways, customs, and habits of American politics and how we relate to our government. So what are some of the key elements of American political culture? What are some of the beliefs that might make someone an American? Okay, well, first off, I believe in liberty, all right? Now, this is another topic for discussion in American politics because there is an inherent tension with liberty and security, okay? If we want to be secure in ourselves and our possessions, a certain sacrifice of liberty is made. And one of the questions is how much a sacrifice is worth it, okay? The meaning of liberty itself is changing. Are we talking about the freedom to be able to do certain things, or the freedom to be free from certain things? You know, is liberty the freedom to own and bear firearms? Or is liberty the freedom to not have to worry about going hungry, or the freedom to not worry about going bankrupt from healthcare costs, okay? So all Americans would agree that liberty is a pretty important part of our political culture. What does liberty exactly mean, and how much liberty? Up for debate. Equality, okay, similarly, all right, all men are created equal, all right, important words in American political culture, but what does that quite mean, okay? Because as many of you are probably well aware of, when our country was first founded, not all people were treated equally. And so throughout the course of our history, our definition of legal equality has changed, okay? Today, arguably all people are equal before the law. But again, another question before us as far as politics go in our country is, what about economic equality? Okay, are we or should we be economically equal? What does that even mean? Does economic equality mean equal tax rates for everybody? Does economic equality mean higher tax rates for some, less for others, in order to lessen the gap between the rich and the poor? Okay, so just like liberty, you know, most Americans would agree that equality is a key part of our political culture, but what exactly that means, up for debate. Capitalism and property, okay, pretty fundamental parts of our political culture and our society is a belief in the private ownership of property, okay? Arguably, our two most left-wing presidents, both Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson, most left-wing in terms of domestic policy anyway, were both capitalists, okay? Opponents, people who are not fans of FDR or LBJ might accuse them of enacting so-called socialist policies. What we mean by socialism we'll cover here briefly in a few moments. But the reality is they did not alter the status of the private ownership of property in our country, okay? Capitalism and property are pretty integral parts of American political culture and values. Consent of the governed and majority rule, okay? This idea that we are a democracy, majority rules, all right? Consent of the governed, going back again to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all right? What makes our government legitimate is that we grant it legitimacy because we are a nation of laws, because we do choose our leaders, and those leaders are chosen through majority vote, okay? We consent to be governed by our government. Lastly, a focus on the individual. All right, now the lecture slide here says individual, family, and community. Of course, you know, family and community do play an important role in American political culture and life. But something to note here is America is significantly more individualistic than many other societies on Earth. Not anything new. Okay, not anything new. That's something that goes back centuries, and that can be, you know, the reasons for that could be discussed in another place, another time. But just understand that while family and community do have important places in American political culture, we are a, by and large, highly individualistic society. Okay. Let's move on and talk a little bit about, kind of briefly introduce ideology. I do want to point out that, again, this is an introductory chapter that we're covering right now. All of this will be covered in greater detail in subsequent lectures or subsequent chapters. So do not fret. We will hear all this all again at some point, but just give us a little bit of a brief background before we start learning more about the Constitution here in a few minutes, okay? So first of all, what do I mean by political ideology? Okay, systems of beliefs regarding politics, policy issues, and the role of government in society. And what we mean by a system, okay, starting with a set of beliefs about the world and then drawing conclusions from them, okay? Here is an attempt to try to explain this, okay? I'm not telling you which is right, which is wrong, or even if maybe one is right, one is wrong, okay? If you believe that fundamentally the world is a just place, that fundamentally people get what they deserve, maybe not all the time, but most of the time, that's going to affect how you approach politics and approach government society. Similarly, if you believe the world to be a fundamentally unjust place, that there is much more injustice in the world than there is justice, that is similarly going to affect how you view politics and government, okay? So let's start off with what is called liberalism, oftentimes known as a left ideology. Well, throughout the course of this lecture series and in your everyday life, you will hear references to left and right in politics. Left-wing politics are the politics of people who view the world as fundamentally unjust, okay? There's a lot of injustice in the world, much more so than there is true justice. And American liberalism largely advocates change to society to improve the well-being of people, okay? And in the modern iteration of American liberalism, we're looking to the state to implement change, to make things better for people, okay? A good example of this could be minimum wage, all right? Many liberals, American liberals, would argue for a higher minimum wage in order to reduce income inequality, okay? Lift poorer people out of their poverty, okay? The government has to set laws to mandate certain wages, because if we leave corporations to their own devices, they will pay people as little as they possibly can. That's opposed by American conservatism, what we call a right ideology, okay? And again, American conservatism is likely going to be the ideology of people who largely believe the world to be a fundamentally just place, okay? Traditionally, the name of the game for conservatism is maintaining the status quo, okay? Yes, things may not be perfect right now, but if we change things too much, they could get worse, okay? If you've heard the cliche, a bird in hand is better than two in a bush, okay, that is the traditional conservative viewpoint. A little bit of change here and there is fine when we really need it, but we really need to be totally sure that change is needed, and we can't do it too radically, okay? In America today, conservatives argue for a limited government role in economics, all right? The government should not interfere in the conduct of the free market, business, corporations. The people, us, should be the only ones who really kind of decide what goes on in the economy. Today, in the United States, far and away the biggest cohorts, the biggest groups of conservatives demographically, or what we call evangelical Christians, and a political group that kind of rose to prominence during President Obama's first term, known as the Tea Party, or our main conservative demographics in the US today. Now, these are not the only ideologies, okay? Your textbook does not devote a whole lot of space discussing these two ideologies, and that's because they are not as popular as liberalism or conservatism, but the reality is they are growing. Going back to this issue of cynicism giving way to anger, okay, people are looking for new ways of approaching politics, all right? Socialism is an ideology that could basically be described as simply just being further left, okay? That's a gross oversimplification for sure, but just to make things easy for right now, more extreme liberalism, okay? Typically, socialists might advocate for extremely high marginal tax rates on the very wealthy, perhaps even wealth taxes, okay, simply taxing the assets and possessions that the wealthy already have, in an attempt to pay for a whole smorgasbord of public services, free healthcare, free education, things like that. Another alternative ideology is that of libertarianism. This one's a little bit more complicated to describe because the reality is, as we'll learn later on, ideology is not two-dimensional. We're talking about left and right. It's really not a just two-dimensional spectrum, okay? So back on the issue of libertarianism, libertarianism is a belief that basically the government should just kind of leave people alone. Except in the most extreme of circumstances, you know, it's probably, most libertarians would probably argue that it's okay to have laws against murder and theft and things like that. But otherwise, the government should not really be getting involved a whole lot in the lives of people, okay? Libertarians can identify as either left or right, but most often identify as right-wing in the United States, okay? So to kind of go back over what we've already been talking about here as far as a changing America for some context here, okay? Growing population, all right? American population is not growing as fast as it once was, but it is still growing. That's different from many other major developed democracies in the world. As mentioned, our population is growing and it's moving. We'd already mentioned at the outset of the lecture, people are leaving rural areas for urban areas in record numbers. But people are also leaving certain regions, notably the Rust Belt, what we might think of as kind of the old Midwest, states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, moving to the Sun Belt, states with warmer climates, the Southeast, places like Texas, Georgia, the Southwest, Arizona, Nevada, okay, where people are moving is having an effect on American politics and how that's changing America. Again, our population is aging, okay? That has ramifications for certain kinds of beliefs. One of the things to talk about as far as ideology goes is that, you know, younger people tend to be more liberal and older people tend to be more conservative, okay? Older people, conservatism tend to be associated with so-called traditional values. All right, you know, again, maintaining the status quo, how things have always been done. If you have an aging population, that means that all things being equal, a certain group of people, older people who are more conservative, are having an outsized influence on American politics today. So even the age of our populations, something important to keep in mind. Growing racial and ethnic diversity, okay? Our population is growing, but not all racial and ethnic groups are growing at the same rate, okay? The reality is people of racial and ethnic minority groups in America are growing at a much faster rate than white Caucasians are, okay? And that is having an effect on American politics and our political culture. Even how our families are structured is rapidly changing. Here in a few chapters, when we discuss political socialization, how we come to learn about politics and government, we'll be discussing how families play an important role in that, and the fact that family structures are changing is an important thing to keep in mind for understanding American politics. That kind of wraps up the introductory part of this lecture from the first chapter. So we're going to go ahead and move on into discussing the Constitution, okay? We will not finish it all on this recording. We'll finish up the Constitution in the next recording. But we are going to get started off with kind of the basics, starting off with what is a Constitution? You know, if you've lived in America for any amount of time, you've probably heard of a or even the Constitution, okay? Our textbook defines the Constitution, or a Constitution, as a document that presents the fundamental principles of a government and establishes the basic structure and procedures by which the government operates to fulfill those principles. What does that mean? Well, here's two simpler questions, okay? The questions of how is government structured and how does government function is what a constitution is for. A constitution is a document that answers those two questions. How is government structured? How does it function? Okay. Any constitution, we're talking about the United States Constitution, the Constitution of Oklahoma, anywhere, okay, all constitutions have three principal elements. They outline a mission of government. What is the purpose of government in that certain area, that certain geographic jurisdiction? How is the government organized? Okay, who gets to do what? And details of the government's operation. How is it going to do what it does? Okay, so for the remainder of this particular recording and in the next one, we're going to be discussing the mission of government, how government is organized briefly, and some brief details of our federal government's operation. Again, not a history lesson, but we do need to cover some history as far as, you know, where our Constitution came from, okay? So as far as the origins of our nation, you all hopefully know about the original settlement of the, again, so-called 13 colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, the 1700s. The reason why these colonies were settled was a number of reasons, most notably religious freedom. The 1600s, a very tense time in Europe, including Britain, for issues of religion. And one of the things that Britain did was, rather than simply force or coerce everybody to following the Church of England or Catholicism, depending on what period of time we're talking about specifically, was if people wanted to move away to North America and practice where they wanted to, they could, okay? Something else to also keep in mind, though, of course, is that in many of these colonies, we do also have the importation of slaves. Particularly these southern colonies, their settlement was not so much over issues of religious freedom as it was to develop plantation agriculture, okay? And as we'll be discussing later on, the issue of slavery is going to be baked into our Constitution, unfortunately, okay? The fact that many people migrated from Britain or elsewhere to North America, making these settler colonies, makes these original 13 colonies a lot different than other colonies established by Britain and other European powers throughout the world, okay? Historically, colonies were established for economic reasons, for basically the extraction of resources, but the reality is, you know, people came from Britain or Europe to live here permanently and to govern themselves, to be left alone in the exercise of their religious freedom or anything else going on, okay? And before going on, something I'm going to reiterate a few times, it can be difficult for us to see this now in the time that we live in, but when these first colonies were being established in North America, there was no sense of predestination of a future United States, okay? These colonies did not see themselves as a special collection of entities politically that were going to become their own country someday, okay? That is not how these colonies and colonists viewed themselves. They viewed themselves as subjects of the English and later British monarchies, okay? That's something important to keep in mind for understanding the development of our Constitution and our political system. Now, these colonies had what we might call a two-tier system of colonial governance, okay? Each colony did have its own legislature. Okay, we already talked about briefly how these colonies were kinds of experiments in democracy, both direct and indirect, but each colony was also governed by the British Parliament. The British already implementing, you know, elections for certain groups of people to be represented in the House of Commons and Parliament, but the colonies had no such direct representation. The colonies did not elect representatives to go serve in the British House of Commons. Um, for most of these colonies, the British Parliament kind of left them alone, kind of left them to their own devices. North America was a long way away from Britain. It really wasn't until the French and Indian War, for you history buffs out there, more commonly known elsewhere in the world as the 7 Years' War. It wasn't really until the 1750s, 1760s that the British Parliament really began to assert itself more and more in the governing of these colonies, largely because of the levying of new taxes. The French and Indian War argued the House of Commons, the British Parliament, largely benefited these North American colonists, so we're going to raise taxes to help pay for that. The colonists did not appreciate the fact that they were being taxed without their ability to be represented in Parliament. And this is kind of the beginnings of colonial resentment and eventually revolt. And so we're going to move on into our Continental Congresses, okay? The first Continental Congress, delegates from these various 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard come together and kind of just are discussing, what's going on. Again, there's not yet any sense that we're going to have a war, we're not going to declare independence, but we are going to assert to the British Parliament that as Englishmen, okay, as subjects of the English monarchy, okay, they have rights, and they feel like their rights are being trampled upon with this taxation without representation. Well, the British Parliament doesn't listen very much, and so they are convened a second Continental Congress, where it's decided that maybe it's time that these 13 colonies do in fact part ways with the British monarchy. Okay, the issuing of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, who draws heavily from John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay, in the Declaration of Independence, which is not by the way, a legal document. Okay, the Declaration of Independence does not have the force of law in our country, but nonetheless, it is a very fundamental document for outlining some of the core beliefs of American political culture. Okay, listing of natural rights, notably the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, of course, you'll note that previously, we discussed that it was John Locke who had quoted or coined the phrase, that our three natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Okay, again, the issue of slavery is going to be a very hot button issue in the founding days of the United States. And so rather than stoke controversy and include the issue of property here, Thomas Jefferson opted for the pursuit of happiness as a amicable compromise that everyone could get behind. We also, in the Declaration of Independence, are asserting the right for the governed to consent to their government, which basically we're saying we don't consent to the British Parliament anymore. And then finally, the right to abolish a government that we do not consent to anymore, and hence Declaration of Independence. We assert ourselves to be free and independent states now, okay? While this is all going on, these colonies, now referring to themselves as states, all have individually their own constitutions, okay? These colonial state constitutions all preceded our first constitution. Okay, the current constitution that we're going to dive into in the next recording is the second constitution of the United States. All right, during the various Continental Congresses, the founding fathers of the United States drafted kind of a makeshift constitution to kind of tie together the 13 colonies fighting for their independence. Okay. Again, I want to emphasize that these colonies really thought of themselves as independent states. They thought themselves more as Massachusetts and Virginia and Maryland and New York and Georgia separately, and less as being parts of a whole United States. Okay, and part of that being is that their constitutions had existed for decades, or in some cases even close to a century before the Revolution began. And these colonial and later state constitutions were pretty radical in a few different ways. First off, they were single written documents and written at a fixed point in time. This is a big departure from the British Constitution. Some of you maybe have heard that the United Kingdom has no constitution. That's not quite true. They do have a constitution. It's just what we call in political science an uncodified constitution, which is to say that it's not all written down in any one place. Some of it's written down here, some of it's written down there, some of it's not written down anywhere. Okay, some of the British Constitution is just norms, customs, and traditions that their government has adhered to for a very long time. The fact that the state constitutions were single documents where people sat down and wrote them at one point in time made them pretty radical political documents. Okay, and they listed the role and rights of citizens as opposed to subjects. Okay, even though British democracy was kind of on the rise, the British monarchy was having less and less influence and power. People still thought themselves as subjects to a monarch in Britain. But these state constitutions talked about the role and place of citizens. Okay, again, kind of an emphasis on the individual and how their rights and privileges precede and supersede those of the government. Okay. So we're going to conclude this particular recording with talking about, briefly, our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So first off, what on earth is a confederation? Okay, again, textbook definition, a union of independent states in which each state retains its sovereignty. Okay. These 13 colonies, 13 states, did come together to form a country, but under the Articles of Confederation, each individual state retained quite a bit of power. Simplest way to put it is the national government under the Confederation was pretty weak. And we'll talk about some of those weaknesses here in just a moment, okay? The primary features of the Articles of Confederation was that it had a unicameral legislature, which is to say that its Congress had one chamber, okay? Hopefully many of you know that Congress today has two chambers, all right? Our current Congress has a House of Representatives and a Senate. All right, in order for Congress to pass a bill, make it a law, a bill has to pass both chambers. While the Articles had a unicameral legislature, that's not important in and of itself, but the fact that we have a bicameral, a two-chamber legislature today, is going to be a consequence of a compromise made to fix one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation. And this unicameral Congress under the Articles had very limited authority, okay? It had the power to kind of coordinate foreign affairs, foreign policy, and provide for common defense of the 13 colonies, could coin money, but had no power to levy taxes. Right at the outset of this lecture, we're talking about how one of the powers of any good government is to raise money to help pay for things. Well, if you're thinking here for a moment, if this Congress under the Articles has the ability to, say, raise an army and defend the nation, but no money to pay for it, you can kind of see a problem here. The Confederate Congress here had to basically ask, pretty please, the various states for money to pay for a common defense and other public goods, and they had a lot of issues getting the states to pay for anything, okay? So some of its notable weaknesses, okay? Limited authority meant limited capacity to handle crises. After the end of the Revolution, 1783, for the next about 4 years, we have in the United States a wave of rebellions and insurrections. Whiskey Rebellion, we have the Bacon Rebellion, things like that. And the Confederate government just really had no ability to deal with these kinds of crises, all right? And by emphasizing the sovereignty of states over the national government, what basically many people saw as coming down the road, if things weren't fixed, was the 13 states of this United States of America were going to wind up breaking apart and probably going their separate ways, okay? So facing bankruptcy and violent rebellions, another convention was called in 1786 to, quote, remedy the defects of the federal government, okay? Many political leaders in the U.S. at the time understood that the Articles weren't working, and we all to have a big sit down together and figure out what are we going to do to fix the articles, okay? So they get together, and rather than fixing the articles, they basically come to the conclusion that the articles as a whole was totally unsalvageable. And so they're just going to throw the Articles of Confederation out the window and start off with a brand new constitution that will be discussed at a new convention beginning the following year, okay? This concludes the first recording, the first part of chapters 1 and 2. Next up, we will be moving on with kind of the origins of the Constitution and going over briefly some of its details, kind of introducing ourselves to the structure of our government that will be covered later on in this course.